Nobody heard the break. They only felt it. One moment, global trade is moving at full throttle. The next, entire shipping lanes tied to China go dark without a single alert. Treasury analysts scroll through empty data fields that should contain billions in orders, as if someone scooped the Pacific clean. Across Silicon Valley, Nvidia's sales terminals spit out zeros where China's demand used to be, erasing months of revenue in minutes. Jensen Huang freezes, not at the numbers but at the pattern. This wasn't a slowdown, it was surgical. Meanwhile, in Washington, Scott Bessent signs an emergency directive after discovering a detail nobody wants to say out loud. The world's largest economy is now reacting to a move that was never officially made. One silent decision in Beijing just rearranged the entire global system. Rare earths sound exotic, but they are everywhere, inside wind turbines, electric vehicles, smartphones, and missiles. Since 2020, China's share of global production has slipped to around 68%, down from 99% a decade earlier. Yet refining, the step that turns rock into usable material, remains almost entirely under Chinese control. Data compiled by Bloomberg and the U.S. Geological Survey show that between 90% and 95% of all rare earth refining occurs inside China. Mining them elsewhere is possible. Processing them profitably is not. Western producers have learned that lesson the hard way. Australia's Lynas Rare Earths, for instance, began constructing a U.S. refinery in Texas backed by Pentagon funding, but costs have tripled. Environmental compliance alone requires more than 100 regulatory steps, and the company still lacks guaranteed buyers. Without long-term offtake contracts, private financing evaporates. That leaves Washington with a dilemma. Impose tariffs on Chinese refined products and risk a cost spiral, or keep importing them and remain strategically exposed. For months, officials debated that trade-off quietly, but then came the September data and a sharper realization. The U.S. can dig its own ore, yet it still must send it to China for processing. If relations deteriorate further, that option could vanish overnight. A senior Commerce Department official admitted to Reuters last week that processing bottlenecks are our single largest vulnerability. This isn't protectionism, it's dependency with a patriotic label. At the center of this storm stands President Trump, insisting tariffs make America stronger. We're in a powerful position because of tariffs, he told reporters at a recent briefing, echoing the same defense used during the first trade war. But the numbers tell a different story. The Peterson Institute estimates U.S. tariffs have raised average import costs by 12% since 2023, while the trade deficit still widened beyond $1.2 trillion last year. Meanwhile, the costs of rebuilding domestic refining facilities stretch beyond fiscal logic. Every ton of separated rare earth oxide produced in the U.S. costs roughly 3 times the Chinese average, according to the Department of Energy's June 2025 report. The economics bend further under scrutiny. Even if the U.S. launches 22 new rare earth projects by 2030, as projected by the International Energy Agency, China could counter at will. Beijing can restrict exports today or flood the market tomorrow, collapsing prices below Western production costs. The same leverage once wielded by OPEC now sits in Beijing's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. That's not a claim, it's arithmetic. By October, the situation deepens. China's Ministry of Commerce imposes new export licensing requirements for specific magnet-grade oxides, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, materials essential to electric motors and guidance systems. The move mirrors the semiconductor restrictions the U.S. placed on China a year earlier. In Beijing's logic, symmetry equals fairness. In Washington's view, it's coercion. The fallout spreads fast. U.S. chip manufacturers already hurting from Chinese counterbans now face a double choke. Nvidia's founder Jensen Huang, speaking during an investor session quoted by the Wall Street Journal in September 2025, said plainly, "We went from 95% market share in China to zero. I can't imagine any policymaker thinking that's a good idea. Nvidia has written off China completely in its forecasts, assuming zero contribution from the world's second largest computer market." Huang stopped short of blaming the White House directly, but the implication was unmistakable. Washington's export controls are costing U.S. firms access to their fastest-growing market. In China, that same vacuum fuels acceleration. Huawei Technologies, once crippled by U.S. sanctions, is ramping up production of its Ascent 910 AI chips. According to data reported by the Financial Times, Huawei expects output to double from 300,000 units in 2025 to 600,000 next year. The scale isn't symbolic, it's substitution in real time. Every chip Huawei sells domestically replaces one the U.S. can no longer supply. Each replacement shifts global innovation capacity eastward. This is where the rare earth story and the semiconductor story converge. Chip fabrication depends on rare earth magnets for lithography systems, cooling units, and wafer handling. Taiwan's TSMC, which manufactures Nvidia's most advanced chips, relies on Chinese processed materials for its equipment supply chain. If Beijing slows shipments, the ripple could reach U.S. foundries within weeks. One senior TSMC executive told Nikkei Asia anonymously, "We can diversify labor and capital, not chemistry." That's the quiet truth few policymakers admit. Let's pause, not for reflection, but for recalibration. If China controls the midstream inputs and the US controls the tariff gun, what happens when both pull triggers simultaneously? The logic begins to loop. Tariffs increase costs. Costs discourage production. Production shortfalls empower the supplier being punished. Economic deterrence becomes economic dependence under a new name. The White House insists it can break that loop through industrial policy. And that's where Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent enters the picture. In a televised briefing reported by Bloomberg on October 11, 2025, Bessent announced what he called a strategic market stabilization framework. Behind the phrasing lies a historic shift. The U.S. government will set price floors for critical minerals and possibly other industrial inputs. The goal, according to Bessent, is to ensure resilient domestic supply by guaranteeing profitability for strategic sectors. The policy reads like command economics grafted onto capitalism. Price floors mean the government decides the minimum acceptable sale price. If market demand falls below it, the Treasury becomes the buyer of last resort. Bessent argued that China's non-market behavior leaves no alternative. Critics disagree. Former Federal Reserve Governor Randall Krossner told the Wall Street Journal that price controls in an inflationary environment risk magnifying imbalances rather than solving them. The logic is simple. Higher guaranteed prices invite oversupply and waste, while taxpayers absorb the cost. The administration believes otherwise. Internal estimates reviewed by Reuters suggest Washington could allocate up to $40 billion in forward purchase agreements to create a strategic mineral reserve. The plan echoes the 1970s petroleum reserve model but applied to metals like neodymium, terbium, and lithium. Bessent's defenders describe it as pragmatic realism. Opponents see panic disguised as policy. Either way, the implications are enormous. If the government locks in elevated prices, producers expand output, consumers retreat, and inventories swell. Economists call it misallocation. Investors call it subsidy arbitrage. Which firms get those contracts? That's the question no one in Treasury will answer directly. Politically connected miners could thrive while smaller refiners collapse under unequal support. Meanwhile, inflation dynamics add another layer. Producer price data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics show industrial input costs already 6% higher year-on-year in September 2025. Adding state-mandated price floors risks embedding that inflation structurally. The irony, a policy meant to stabilize prices could institutionalize volatility. Across the Pacific, Beijing watches quietly. State media calls U.S. price controls proof that free markets exist only in textbooks. Yet China itself has practiced similar policies for years. Minimum purchase prices for rare earth concentrate, central procurement for strategic stockpiles, and strict quotas on export volume. The real difference lies in narrative control. When Beijing intervenes, it calls it coordination. When Washington does, it calls it defense. Inside the U.S., corporate frustration grows. American Semiconductor and renewable energy executives warn that government intervention could distort investment signals just when private capital is most needed. One CEO of a mid-sized battery materials firm told the Financial Times anonymously that we need demand certainty, not artificial price promises. Yet markets react faster than debate. Shares of U.S. mining ETFs surged 15% in the week following Bessent's remarks, proof that speculation loves stability more than ideology. Still, the math remains merciless. Building a domestic rare earth supply chain from mine to magnet could take a decade and over $100 billion in cumulative investment, according to the International Energy Agency's 2025 projection. Even with subsidies, the U.S. cannot compress time. Experience, not capital, is the scarce resource, and that experience sits in Chinese refineries from Inner Mongolia to Jiangxi. As each side doubles down, interdependence paradoxically tightens. China restricts exports to defend sovereignty. The U.S. restricts imports to defend industry. The result, mirrored protectionism feeding shared inflation. Consumers pay twice, first through tariffs, then through taxes that fund compensation schemes. Logic bends under ideology's weight. Bessent, to his credit, recognizes the risk but frames it as unavoidable. In a CNBC interview archived October 15, 2025, he said, "We're not abandoning markets, we're reinforcing them against manipulation. Whether that's conviction or justification is subjective, but the admission is striking. For decades, Washington condemned price controls as the hallmark of failing states. Now it embraces them in the name of resilience. Meanwhile, Nvidia's predicament crystallizes the larger dilemma. U.S. innovation depends on global demand, yet global demand increasingly flows through Chinese ecosystems the U.S. is fencing off. According to Bloomberg Intelligence, Chinese AI startups purchased roughly $7 billion worth of domestic chips in 2025, up from less than $1 billion 3 years earlier. Each lost sale for Nvidia becomes a grant for Huawei's R&D. Market exclusion is not stasis, it's redirection. That feedback loop leads back to the starting point. The refinery gate in Baotou, the export form stamped restricted, the policy memo in Bessent's briefcase. Each decision answers one crisis while breeding another. Tariffs defend independence but destroy margins. Export bans protect sovereignty but fragment supply chains. Price floors preserve industries but distort prices. Every measure is a cure that mimics the disease. What's left is a question neither side wants to face. If both Washington and Beijing believe they're defending the market from manipulation, who's left defending the market itself? By the end of the week, the world's data streams still don't agree on what happened. Shipping logs contradict customs filings. Semiconductor forecasts clash with real-time output. Treasury models keep throwing the same impossible result. The system is moving without a center. Beijing doesn't clarify. Washington doesn't retreat. Every capital waits for someone else to blink first. And in that hesitation, a new reality forms. One where supply chains don't fail loudly, they vanish quietly. Where markets don't crash, they reorganize themselves around whoever holds the choke points. And the most unsettling part isn't the crisis you just watched unfold. It's the realization that this was only the adjustment phase. The real reset hasn't started yet. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.